The Chris Johnston Show.
Let's go!
Your number one destination for a behind-the-scenes look at the game of hockey.
Is this thing on?
Here's NHL insider Chris Johnston and host Julian McKenzie.
CJ, let's begin our show with the Edmonton Oilers. Chris Knoblauch relieved of his head coaching duties with the Edmonton Oilers. How did we get here, and what's next for the Edmonton Oilers after this news?
Well, I mean, a little too soon to say. I mean, obviously there was a report this week from Frank Saravalli about the Oilers seeking permission to speak with Bruce Cassidy. And, you know, at this time that still hasn't been granted to them. So, you know, obviously it was a difficult season in a lot of ways for the Oilers. They never got to the level that they aspired to in the regular season. You know, their playoff run ended in 6 games against the Anaheim Ducks. And, you know, I think everyone understands the stakes for this team. You know, that being said, it's still kind of an unusual situation. Chris Knoblauch coached effectively 2.5 years in Edmonton, you know, 2 trips to the Stanley Cup final. You know, they did get to the playoffs again this last year. So he was in 9 playoff rounds with the team during that time. And he had signed a 3-year contract extension in October that's yet to take effect. And so, you know, for him to find himself out of a job, I think illustrates, you know, just how tough yet again the coaching world can be. And, you know, basically 2 to 3 years is the shelf life of an NHL head coach, even when you're one that's had a fair amount of success as Chris did with the Oilers, you know, in the last couple of seasons. Now, you know, the other thing I'd say is we know the stakes of next season in Edmonton. It's, you know, it's very possible Connor McDavid is there much longer, but the only year I think they can count on him being an Oiler for certain is next year. So, you know, this move speaks to, I think, the urgency in which the organization intends to act in terms of giving itself the best chance to become a champion next season.
I know coaches get fired, but what did you make of how this story unfurled, where there was the report from Frank Saravalli that they sought permission to talk to Bruce Cassidy? Like, it felt like for days it was going to be a foregone conclusion that Chris Knoblauch was going to be fired. And I get maybe that some other coaches who are in worse situations go through something like this, but it's still a little peculiar for a guy who, as we've mentioned, over the last 2.5 years has led the Oilers to 2 Stanley Cup final berths and then the first round exit this year.
Yeah, I just term it as unfortunate. I think, you know, obviously I can't imagine anyone in the Oilers wanted it to go this way. The Golden Knights aren't incentivized in any way to have this become public. And obviously Chris Knoblauch, someone, you know, he's with a family, he's got kids that have to go to school and the whole bit. And you know, it's not the most pleasant way, I guess, for your tenure to end. But, you know, and I don't want to just slough it off, but it is kind of part of the business. And, you know, this is, you know, part of living your life in the public eye, the way people that work for teams do, the way the players do. Obviously, sometimes, whether it's trade rumors or, you know, something similar, I mean, this is something that people in the professional sports business have to go through from time to time. But, you know, I'm not certainly going to be critical of Frank. If we had that information, we would have been talking about it on our podcast too. It's not, you know, that's him doing his job and, you know, basically does create this awkward dynamic where not only have they not got the chance to talk to Bruce Cassidy, they're not in a position to hire him, you know, obviously. And then, you know, but the someone has the job, you know, comes to understand they're looking for a replacement. You know, it's it's too bad. And you know, in the off season, I guess, is the other thing that makes it most unusual. I mean, at times teams have to make those arrangements amid a busy schedule. And so clearly, you know, for example, when Chris Knoblauch was hired, just the logistics of talking to him, he was coaching in Hartford at the time. They played a game in San Jose, was the last game that Woodcroft coached the Oilers. I mean, clearly there had to be some, you know, planning behind the scenes in order to execute dropping him in there. But in that case, I think it's a little more understandable just because it's during the season. I mean, what are you going to do? You got games to play. The off season is a little more unusual just because, you know, obviously there's a lot of time to work with here, but What it tells me is the Oilers didn't want to just fire Chris Knoblauch for the sake of it. They wanted to, target at least one specific individual that could potentially be hired as his replacement. And, it's still not clear. This, maybe the weirdest of it all is, even as of Thursday morning, with news of his firing, we still don't know for certain if they're going to get to talk to Bruce Cassidy. I mean, I think it's clear. I would call Bruce Cassidy the most sought after name on the coaching market. It's not clear that he might not have another option he prefers over potentially Edmonton, even if they do get permission. So, a new coaching search begins in Edmonton. Obviously, we have one starting in Toronto. The LA Kings are still looking for their head coach, and I think there's still the possibility of other changes around the league too. So, the coaching market is maybe a bit late developing, but here we are in mid-May, and it's fairly frothy.
Any insight as to why Vegas is withholding permission for the Oilers to talk to Cassidy? Is there any other insight we can go into on that?
Not really, because, they haven't said anything. I don't have specific information. I think it's fair for us to look at it from the outside and say, well, yeah, Edmonton is likely Vegas's biggest threat on a yearly basis in the Pacific Division. Although obviously the Anaheim Ducks have entered that equation. They're currently playing Vegas in a playoff series with a pretty young team that I don't think is going away in the next few years. So it could be down to that. I think in the past Vegas has acted in a similar manner, maybe not with someone who could be a head coach, but, I do believe that they've, when they have someone under contract, I mean, while there's kind of an industry standard that you allow them to go seek work elsewhere, I mean, they are still paying Bruce Cassidy. There's nothing that has to compel them to do so. And at this point, all we know is they haven't granted permission. It doesn't mean they've denied it outright. So, it could just be a taking time tactic. But to be clear, I'm guessing because I don't have any specific information. I think, the divisional aspect though, likely has come into play here. And, but at the same time, you fired the guy, looking at it, you can't keep him working without work forever. You wouldn't think. And, the one thing I do know is Bruce Cassidy is anxious to get back behind the bench. He wants to coach next season. And I think there's multiple teams, frankly, that have openings that would like to talk to him, if not all of them. And, I don't know if or when that's going to happen because he's under contract for one more year in Vegas. And so any team that does formally talk to him would have to be granted that permission.
Also, and I know I've seen it written about before, but probably a good opportunity for us to establish this now. Vegas doesn't have to accept compensation in the event that they say, hey, you know what, like we're going to let Bruce Cassidy speak to insert team here. I can imagine there are a few people who look at the situation and wonder if it's a situation where like, hey, maybe we have to make a trade to sweeten the deal type of thing.
No, I mean, it's not actually formally allowed anymore. There was a time 10 to 15 years ago where there was all these second and third round picks, if you remember, being traded between teams when whether GM candidates or coaching candidates were hired by a rival team. In this case, the benefit to Vegas would be Edmonton would start paying either most or all of Bruce Cassidy's remaining salary. So there's a financial incentive to have your coach get hired after you've fired him. But, this is still a little unusual. I don't think it's entirely unprecedented. I've heard of some situations in the past similar to this where, a team might not initially grant, the opportunity to speak to another team. But, I look at, for example, when the Leafs fired Sheldon Keefe 2 years ago, at that time, his contract extension hadn't kicked in. They fire him within a couple days. New Jersey requests to speak to him. They start to speak to him. They hire Sheldon Keefe, I think, within a week or less of when he was fired in Toronto. And then obviously they assume the financial responsibilities that come with that. I mean, that's the far more normal way this plays out. But, I think we just have to see where it goes. I don't want to hammer it too hard because I can't imagine this is going to last into next season. Like I would think that there'll be some sort of resolution here. But the whole thing is a little strange. I mean, this is not, I can't remember us covering something quite like this, specifically the way Knoblauch's time in Edmonton comes to an end. I'll say this, having been around them in the playoffs, I certainly got the feeling this was a possibility. Like, I don't think it's a major surprise. They're making a coaching change, just because, again, the stakes are so high. There was some pretty open-ended comments at times through the season. One time from Connor McDavid where after a loss to Tampa, he was sort of praising John Cooper and his professional coaching. Leon Draisaitl had some pretty candid comments. To be fair, that included the front office and the coaching staff and the players, but he sort of seemed to single out the coaching staff a bit. So, I think that it really was a hard year in Edmonton. And, Stan Bowman at the locker cleanout day had said he wanted to take time to review things. And even that sort of suggested this was a possibility. So, I don't think anyone is completely caught off guard by the notion they're changing the coach. It's just the way it ended up being handled and rolled out publicly again, and basically because a journalist did his job, that made it a little more sloppy at the end, and not ideal, I guess I'd put it.
Yeah, I just think it's just tough. Look, I understand that it's cup or bust in Edmonton. You have to find a way to be successful as long as you have Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl on your team. But just the fact that this took a certain amount of days where we're all just wondering, like, hey, is Chris Knoblauch going to lose his job? Like, that's tough. I think we're allowed to look at this from a human point and be like, man, like, this is a tough deal for a guy who, for the first time coaching in with the Oilers, doesn't make it to a Stanley Cup final and he loses his job. Like, that's professional, but like the fact that like it took this long is sloppy. I agree with that. I agree with that descriptive.
For sure. And look, at least in this case, he had that extension. I mean, from a financial standpoint, he's pretty well taken care of here. And I would imagine that we're going to see him down the road behind a bench too. I mean, maybe because he has the benefit of that extension, he's not in the same rush to go out and get another job tomorrow. But given all the winning the Oilers did with Chris Knoblauch there, I would think he's definitely earned a crack at another job down the road. And, this could work out well for him. Certainly from the financial standpoint, he's taken care of and his family's taken care of. And, maybe a little break and reset and get going again will be good for his career too.
Okay, last Oilers question. Let's say for whatever reason, Vegas decides they're not going to let Bruce Cassidy be available to them for whatever reason. What type of coach, or if you have any other people in mind, what is the type of coach the Edmonton Oilers need to have for next season so they can finally win a Stanley Cup?
I think it's got to be an experienced coach, because, you really are talking about putting the team in a position where when they get to the playoffs next year, they have everything they need to go on a playoff run again. I think the risk with a younger coach is there just would be a bit of a learning curve at the highest level of the game, that you could get in a series against, whether it's a John Tortorella in Vegas or Joel Quenneville if you play Anaheim again, like an experienced coach, and that, you're not ready to properly, handle that moment. So, there's a few names out there. Peter Laviolette still is interested in getting behind the bench. He's obviously taken multiple teams over the years to the Stanley Cup final. His teams have had pretty much success everywhere that he's been. I know he's been around a lot, and so might not be as exciting of a name, but I feel like you have to go with someone from a Cassidy, Laviolette kind of ilk, just because of the stakes of that season. I don't think it's not a learning year. It's not a grow with the group year, the way even in Toronto, when we get to the Leafs discussion, we might be talking about that kind of person. I think, it's got to be someone standing behind the players that you have a whole lot of confidence is ready to do the job. And look at the last two coaches they had in Edmonton, Chris Knoblauch and Jay Woodcroft. It was both of their first times as head coaches in the NHL. So, and I'm not saying that can't work, because obviously Knoblauch came in mid-season. They went to the Cup final that year, and then they went through the Cup final the following season. But I really do think that you're going to see Stan Bowman, land on someone with with credentials and who's been there, done that, and is going to come in and know how to operate a team that has a chance to win. And obviously this doesn't ease the pressure on the front office. I mean, Stan Bowman gets to keep coming to work, but he knows he made moves this season that didn't really push the group forward, didn't give them a better chance to win. And so, he's got to bring back a better roster to go with the coaching staff they ended up deciding on.
Starts with goaltending too on that, because Tristan Jarry's not cutting it for this group. Okay, CJ, let's go to the Toronto Maple Leafs. Craig Berube out as head coach of the team. What can you tell us about how the Leafs got here and what could be next?
I'll tell you that, I think this is down to performance last year for the team. Ultimately, John Chayka and Matt Sundin have been meeting with players and staff members in the organization for 10 days since they were hired. Craig Berube flew into Toronto and they had a meeting over the weekend that stretched over a couple hours. I think that was, an information gathering session, not so much a job interview. But as Chayka and Sundin got a handle on what happened last season, I think along the way with those conversations, I don't think it was any one thing. But it became clear that a fresh start was probably in order for the Leafs next year. And frankly, I think it makes a lot of sense. Now, Chayka didn't really get into that in his press availability on Wednesday. I think part of that is two things. Craig Berube had an immense amount of respect within the Leafs organization. I think he was very well liked on a personal level by staff with the team, the players. I could tell you, even from a media standpoint, even as difficult as this season was in Toronto, never really stepped in it. You know what I mean? Never didn't lose his cool too often. And I think that there were opportunities where someone, maybe not as in control of their emotions might have, had some tough times in front of the press. Cause, look, the Leafs started the season, with high expectations and ended up finishing 28th. They had a 30-point drop in the standings, the largest in their franchise's history. And so, ultimately the reason I think we got here is just that is there had to be, a price paid for, the situation they found themselves in. There's a recognition that's not all on coaching. It's not all on Craig Berube, but also, look, this is a new time for this organization. The front office is being rebuilt and restructured even as we speak. I think the roster is going to look fairly different, at least kind of different. We'll see how much work they can get done in the early part of the summer. And then, to have a fresh look and feel behind the bench, I think only makes sense. And so, if you contrast this with the Edmonton conversation we just had, I think the Leafs can be open to all kinds of different coaches. It doesn't mean they can't hire someone with experience. And Chayka did mention, there's some appeal to that. But I think that they can really cast a wide net and, look at whether it's coaches in the American Hockey League, maybe somewhere else. I mean, one team still in the playoffs hired their coach out of Pee Wee, the Montreal Canadiens. Now, obviously, Marty St. Louis is a unique case because was an accomplished player, had a relationship with Kent Hughes and Jeff Gorton, so was well known, a commodity that way. But the fact of the matter is, he took over a team and hasn't held back their development. And in fact, I think you can argue it's helped grow it. And so, not saying the Leafs will go to that length, but I do think we have to remind ourselves that it's a story that tells you that there's more coaches out there than maybe appear on the coaching lists immediately when these firings happen. That there's other options if you're willing to have an open mind. And my sense is the Leafs are willing to have an open mind, with this search and consider a whole bunch of things. And, really there's no urgency to hire someone next week either. So, I think they have one area where they might have some time on their side is working through this. So, for Craig Berube, it was what a time in Toronto. The first season, 108 points, win the Atlantic Division, push Florida to the brink in the second round, come within a win of getting to the conference final for the first time in a long time. And then the second season, you tumble to the bottom of the standings. They win the draft lottery. His boss is fired in Brad Treliving late in the year. And ultimately he's fired with 2 years left on his contract. So, I mean, that's that's the hockey business. That's the coaching business in a nutshell, looking at the peaks and valleys of Craig Berube's time with the Leafs.
Yeah, but sometimes those peaks and valleys are a little bit elongated over like 5 or 6 years. It's just 2 years. That's when you put it like that, that is an adventure in itself.
It is. It's wild. And, for Berube, he was brought in. It's reminiscent of the Knoblauch situation in a sense, because when he was hired 2 years ago, the Leafs were in cup or bust mode still. And they were obviously, he got a 4-year contract at that time. He had other options. The Senators actually, went down the road to try to hire him before it ended up with Travis Green. Instead, that summer, there were other teams in the mix for Berube services. And with his Stanley Cup on his resume, I mean, he had the ability to get a 4-year contract, but I think it was always understood that, it would be tough to see that through unless the team, won. And they didn't ultimately win nearly enough games this year. And a lot of things that the coaching staff could influence, defensive metrics, specialty teams, things like that, just weren't up to par for the Leafs. That's how you add it all together. That's how you end up with a 28th place finish. I could have saw a world where he was back. I know there's a lot of talk in the market here in Toronto locally that, with those 2 years left on his deal, that the team might not want to pay him that much money not to be coaching. But ultimately, I think this is the right move from a hockey standpoint, to have a true fresh start for the organization, to get a chance to turn things around here on the go. And, we'll see what they end up trotting out as a head coach. Cause, as I mentioned, it wouldn't surprise me if it was a name that isn't as prominent, in a lot of these discussions as we typically see.
Is it too soon to cast that wide net of possibilities, specifics as to who could be that next coach in terms of it? Obviously, you have your experienced candidates like a Bruce Cassidy, obviously tied to this job, or also maybe someone a little bit younger, someone a little bit more unknown. Anyone in particular you're thinking of?
Well, the Leafs had Manny Malhotra on their bench as an assistant coach for a few seasons before he went to Abbotsford, where he won Calder Cup. Now, I say that knowing the Vancouver Canucks probably aren't eager to let him go. Sort of a couple unique dynamics. The Vancouver Canucks with the 3rd draft pick might be looking at drafting his son Caleb too, which could be a factor one way or another if they want Manny Malhotra as their head coach if that happened. But I think he makes a lot of sense to look at as, we'll call him a younger candidate who's kind of paid his dues and, has been an NHL assistant, obviously an AHL head coach who's had success, and someone who's familiar to the people within the Leafs organization. Look at someone maybe like Jeff Halpern, another former player who's been on Tampa's bench, coached beside John Cooper now for a few seasons. Would he make some sense? I'm throwing darts out there a little bit, but I guess the point is there's probably people that aren't in the public eye that have kind of, accumulated the skills needed to do it. The question is, do you want to throw someone like that into the job in Toronto? And my answer is Marty St. Louis. My answer is Montreal is a pretty red hot market. Now, the one differentiator there is when St. Louis was hired by the Canadiens, they were in their rebuild, right? The expectations of winning weren't there as quickly, whereas it does seem, at least at this moment, quite possible that, the Leafs are still going to be talking about getting back to the playoffs next year. Now, John Chaika hasn't said that yet. Keith Pelly had said it in some prior media availabilities, but, Chaika's been pretty careful so far, and I think quite smartly with his public comments in terms of setting the expectations for the team. I did actually ask him outright when at the press conference where he was hired about would they consider themselves a bigger rebuild, kind of getting into that. And he basically said, let's have this conversation in September when I see what we've been able to do over the summer. So, but I do think that maybe the one potential fly in the ointment to going with someone who doesn't have a ton of experience, is that they're hoping to win as well. I just don't think that any of us can sit here and say they're going to be winning the Stanley Cup next spring. I mean, clearly there's a build back up process that has to go on. They're in a very tough division. You don't see teams jump from 28th back into the playoffs too often. Now, usually teams that finish 28th don't have Auston Matthews and William Nylander still in the primes of their career. So there's some unique factors there that, I think that don't prevent them from saying they can do it. But, the Leafs, I do think that they can consider a wider pool because it's not next year or bust by any stretch for Toronto.
How much did the uncertainty around Auston Matthews' future play a role in the decision to fire Craig Berube?
Well, John Chaika was asked that specifically and said 0, none. I'll take him at his word on that. I mean, I don't have any reason to believe Auston Matthews behind the scenes was involved in these discussions at all. My sense is he wants to stay out of directing the team in specific ways. He wants the new management group to come in and make their own assessments and do what they're paid to do, which is, find ways to upgrade the roster in ways that they see fit. While Auston Matthews is obviously an important member of the Leafs, he wears the captaincy. Like, I don't have any illusions about his importance to the organization. I don't think he's ever been the sort of guy that's having discussions with the GM about we need to go get this kind of player or trade this guy or fire this guy. I think, a lot of hockey players aren't really like that. I mean, probably the one who would have the most ability to do whatever he wants within his organization would be Sidney Crosby, just because of what he's accomplished, how long he's been there. He's been the captain for like 20 years already. And over the years, he's been flat out resistant from giving specific kind of instructions to the front office. He hasn't wanted to meddle in that way, sort of, managers manage, coaches coach, players play kind of vibe. I think it's a similar situation for Matthews. Now, that being said, if you're coming in with fresh eyes, whether that player is saying something or not, I think that it's fair to look at the way Matthews was used on Berube. The 2 seasons that Craig Berube coached in Toronto were, seasons in which obviously Auston Matthews was dealing with injuries. So this is a factor, but it's also his 2 lowest goal scoring outputs of his NHL career. So, again, not putting that all on the coach. I think ultimately the player wasn't healthy enough, wasn't consistent enough. He's got to find ways to contribute with his, abilities too. But, you might conclude, hey, we need someone else to see, other ways that the team can play that isn't, dump the puck in and get on the forecheck as much as Berube liked to have the team play. The Leafs did make some adjustments in season last year. But ultimately, I think it's fair to say, one thing John Chaika or the Leafs mentioned in the press release announcing Craig Berube's firing Julian was this is part of an organizational shift. I would suggest they took a shift in the last couple seasons towards more big guys that hit and get in on the forecheck and play a certain style of game. And then they're like, oh, wow, we need more skill. And so, this hasn't been spelled out explicitly for me, but I think it's fair to read into all of this as the Leafs are going to try to lean into a more skilled game moving forward. And so part of that would be coaching. Part of it's going to be making some roster decisions. And then, ultimately you hope a player like Auston Matthews, does return to Toronto and is going to be the best, something closer to the best version of himself, because you haven't seen that enough the last 2 seasons.
We are literally seeing in real time a franchise that swung the pendulum too far the other way and is doing everything they can to bring it back to, I guess, the middle, because this is a team that is built on skill in its offense, and they realized they needed that grit and they went too deep into it. And now they're trying to go back towards a skill game. That's what that sounds like to me.
And what's the one thing John Chaika has said publicly that he wants to fix is the blue line. Like of the things he's been specific about, and there's not many, that was the area. Well, Brad Treliving built this blue line in his own vision, right? He wanted big, tall guys, basically box out around the net, but they don't have enough basically puck distributors and movers from the back. And so, I would think that's high on the wish list, is trying to get a little more mobile or puck moving defenseman to get the puck up to your skilled forwards. And you're right, round and round we go. But that, to be fair, I do think that's part of trying to. The Leafs had a lot of years of knocking at the door, and they were looking for different answers, and obviously they didn't find them. Now it's a little more open question about where they are? Have they gone too far? Is there time to bring it back? Getting this number 1 overall pick certainly doesn't hurt the organization's direction, big picture, but there's still a lot of open questions here. I've seen people label this like, a fast start for John Chaika in the GM's chair. I wouldn't quite go that far. I think this was the obvious decision, fire the coach, given, how the season played out, given where they're at. Winning the draft lottery is a huge bounce of the lottery balls for, the new GM and for Matt Sundin, his partner in crime. But, ultimately, that these guys are going to have to, once they get through this information gathering period and get through their amateur scouting meetings and, get into June, they're going to have to find ways to make significant improvements to the roster. And I'm going to sit here and say it's not going to be easy.
I have one more Leafs question, but is there anything else you'd like to add about Craig Berube before I get there?
Not really. Other than just, maybe putting another point on the fact that Berube was a pretty compelling and interesting Leafs coach, just in the sense that I don't remember a coach who handled the media so level-headed the entire time. I think in a lot of ways he was what the Leafs needed, but, it didn't work. And so, when the results aren't there, you end up where you are. But he was a pretty unique coach. I've covered a whole bunch of them now, probably 8 or 9 during my years in this seat. And, I appreciated kind of his mannerisms and the way he was steady around this team. But, the fall offs in their game, they just got outshot too much, outchanced too much. I do think some of that's on the personnel, but obviously the coaches need to find answers as well.
I know you're just throwing out a number, but only 8 or 9 coaches you've covered?
Oh, man. I mean, Pat Quinn was the first coach that was behind the Leafs bench when I was first coming to games. So in no particular order, since then, we had Ron Wilson, Randy Carlyle, Peter Horacek for a time was an interim coach for a half season. Obviously, Mike Babcock, Sheldon Keefe, Craig Berube. I don't know how many that is.
That's 6.
So it's only, Paul Maurice.
Yeah. Damn.
2 years of Paul Maurice, so 7. Again, I'm going a little out of order. But yeah, I think it's 7. There you go.
Okay, because I think if I go through my time covering hockey, it might be as much. I might have just as much.
But you're jumping from team to team. I mean...
Right, but still funny.
Well, yeah, it is funny too as well that... like in Edmonton, this is going to be the 6th coach when they make to the next hiring of the Connor McDavid era. The Leafs actually haven't really changed coaches that much with their players. I know there's some people like to opine on that online, but they've actually been relatively stable. Sheldon Keefe, I think, coached 5 years in Toronto. Mike Babcock was more than 4. So those are above average length of terms for coaches, which is kind of crazy.
I think since 2020, Travis Green is the only coach I've covered who's lasted beyond like 2 seasons that I've covered. And I know I've bounced around, but like there's been a lot of like in Calgary, for example, it was Daryl Sutter and then Ryan Huska, for example. In Montreal, it was like Claude Julien, then Dominic Ducharme, then Marty St. Louis. And now it's Travis Green. So I'm just a stupid little observation, but just funny when you just said it was that small of a number. I was like, really? Like,
there you
might
go.
actually be close. Anyway, the Leafs question I had for you, honestly, I'm not going to lie. Maybe I should have done more homework, but it's something I noticed online. You were on Overdrive yesterday. Shout out to Overdrive on TSN 1050. And they put up this tweet that I'm just going to read straight up. Chris Johnston on Overdrive said he heard from a member from one NHL team that they would give up more for Matthew Knies than Auston Matthews. For people like me who don't listen to Overdrive every single day, can you give more context as to why the conversation went there and on what you said?
Gladly. Now, I radioed myself with that because...
You did, and you don't like to be radioed, so that's why I was very surprised to see it.
Yeah, I mean, look, it is something that was said to me. Like, that's the truth. But what it lacks is a whole bunch of context. And it was, we're having a conversation and Jeff O'Neill said, why was Matthew Knies' name even out there at the trade deadline? And then I explained that I think, at times we underestimate how debilitating these no movement clauses are in terms of getting fair value back in a trade. When a player comes, no matter how great the player is, and in Auston Matthews, you're talking about the best goal scorer of his era. If a player wants to be moved but has a no movement clause and says, I want to go to team X, and then you can only deal with team X, there's some really unique dynamics there. First of all, that team knows that the player wants to go there. So why are they emptying the canister? The other thing is the player wants to go there because presumably among many things he likes about that team, he wants a chance to win. So he doesn't want that team to trade a whole bunch of good things back to the Leafs that weakens their roster. And, so those are hard trades to do well on. And so I said the reason Matthew Knies' name was out there is because he's a young player. He's got a unique skill set. He skates well. He's a big body. He's produced points in the NHL, scored goals. And he's locked in for 6 more years at a cost-controlled number, basically locked in for the rest of his 20s. And the Leafs had an ability to go to all 31 other teams to get the best offer before, ultimately, obviously, they didn't trade him. But the reason his name was out there is because as a trade asset, again, in the eyes of at least one person who does this for a living, and I just was sharing that story, as a trade asset, Matthew Knies could be seen by some teams as more valuable than Auston Matthews. Not saying Knies will ever be better than Auston Matthews. That's really the point of the story. The point of the story is that, Auston Matthews is a supernova talent, and he's still only 28, turning 29 in September. Like, he still has career left. And obviously lots of teams would love to be able to line up and make a deal to acquire him. But the odds of a team, knowing they could get Matthews because he wanted to go there, giving up more than what the Leafs could get for Knies, again, it's not my opinion. That's the opinion of someone who works in the business and has been in the business for a long time without sharing or hinting at who it was that told me that, but someone who's, trust me, credible in this kind of conversation. He had made that point to me at some point recently when we were having a conversation. So, I know it's hard to get your mind around, but players aren't just traded like for the player that is. Like, there's a lot of things attached to it. Obviously, the age, the contractual status, the money. I mean, Matthew Knies signed a long-term deal. I think it's around $7 and a bit million. That's probably going to be pretty cheap in this rising cap environment for what he brings. I think it's fair to think he's going to get better. And, what made him a pretty interesting trade asset is teams don't tend to trade players like that at that age. And the Leafs could go to multiple teams. I think there was 4 or 5 they identified as probably having the kind of pieces they would need to make that trade and have those conversations. Ultimately, he wasn't moved. Now it's a new front office. I don't have any reason to believe at this time that John Chaika is going to revisit some of those talks that were had at the deadline with Brad Treliving. But problem is you say one sentence and that's what gets grabbed, and then people are like, what the hell, you're crazy. And it's like, no, I'm not actually. If you think about it, if you're trading for Auston Matthews today, you probably know you're the one organization that he would waive his no move to go to. He controls the situation. That's a different thing than getting to trade for Matthew Knies locked into a contract and he doesn't have a say where he goes.
Well, for the record, you're not crazy, CJ. I just want that known.
I mean, my mentions have been a minefield the last week and a half, 2 weeks. So this just adds to the party.
Yeah, let's not read those mentions. Let's take a break.
I'm enjoying it. I'm not.
At least
I laugh at them, but the pretty pointed commentary in there.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you could see some humor in this. Do you have any insight as we go from another Canadian market to another? Do you have any other insight on the Vancouver Canucks and what seems to be happening with their search for a new GM and where they might be at?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's Ryan Johnson and the Sedins. I think that appears to have been the winner. I mean, it was kind of a unique set of searches with, obviously, we talked about Evan Gold's name on our Monday show, going right down to the wire, and ultimately they pivot in this direction where, it's a set of people that have worked inside the organization already that are getting elevated to higher jobs. And I guess that's maybe a little bit of a surprise, but it was a twisty turny Canucks search, but it sounds as though that's the direction they're going to go. And obviously, for them, it's they're in the early throes of a rebuild. So Some patience will be required no matter who was hired there. And, sounds like it's going to be Johnston and the Sedins at those jobs.
Okay. I don't want to go too much into the playoffs. We don't need to do like that much of a whip around. But I do want to mention Nathan McKinnon and the Colorado Avalanche getting the job done yesterday over the Minnesota Wild. They advanced to the conference final. I saw a lot of people look at his game-tying goal yesterday, and they made a comparison to a similar situation that arose for him in the gold medal game against Team USA, where he missed on an angle. And I get you don't like the comparison. I feel a little weird for him for it. What did you make of people talking about it? And of course, that game for Nathan McKinnon and the Avs.
Well, it was an awesome goal. I mean, it was such a cool goal. The Avs needed it. He's their star player. And just kind of the angling of it was, you almost have to watch it to be like, how did that get by Wallstead? Even Wallstead told the reporters afterwards he thought he played it right, but obviously his angle was a little bit off, and it was just a great shot by McKinnon. I get that you can freeze frame it and compare it to what happened in Milan, but what's different is McKinnon had time last night on the goal, right? He was set up and then shot. What happened in Milan, it was more of a bang play, and I think he rushed it. And obviously, I would like Nathan McKinnon's odds to score on a similar chance to what he had in Milan, like 9 out of 10 times, but that was the 1 out of 10 where, he didn't connect and didn't put it in the net. And, that was a 2-1 loss to the US in overtime. And so any goal, obviously, in that kind of game was going to be a massive goal. So it's not really the same play, but you can freeze, he's on the same side of the ice, and, he's got a lot more net to shoot at in the Milan chance when you see the pictures side by side. But, he's not in a stationary position holding the puck, with the ability to fire the way he was in the goal he scored against Minnesota. Either way, I don't think it atones for it. I think if we had Nathan on here and we're able to pour some truth serum down his throat, as big a deal as it is for them to get back to the conference final in Colorado, as much as that comeback was obviously huge, sparked by his tying goal. I don't think he'd tell you that he's totally over the miss in Milan or this completely atones for it. But, if Colorado goes on and wins the Stanley Cup, which they very well might, based on how good that team looks right now, I'm sure that'll ease some of whatever memories that Nathan has from the gold medal game.
Is Nathan McKinnon worthy of being the first ever guest on this show?
Yes. Now, it's never going to happen.
I know.
But he's definitely, he's more than worthy. I mean, you're talking about pretty awesome player. I mean, the NHL PR put out a stat after he scored that tying goal. He's scored in 46.2% of his playoff games. I mean, that's pretty unreal, tied for the third best percentage in league history. So basically 1 out of 2 playoff games this guy's played, and he's over 100 for his career. He's scored in. So, that's a big reason. He scored in all 5 games in the series against Minnesota. That's a big reason why they got through. The only question for the Avalanche, you can't help but notice Cale Makar leaving the bench frequently throughout that series. Now they may get a little bit of rest and break here before the start of the Western Conference Final. But Makar's status and his ability to get back to something like full health, or is it basically how available is he going to be for the future rounds, I think is an open question. And obviously he's a key part of them, having a chance to win. But, add it all up. You've got Carolina on the east side going 8-0 through round 1 and 2, and you've got Colorado going 8-1. Could be a crash course for the Cup final, but we'll see.
I want Carolina, Colorado. I know I put out that tweet yesterday about it. I want that collision course to happen between those two teams. I feel they're the most deserving. We'll see how the conference finals go for both of those teams, but I would not be upset if the 2 best teams from either conference meet each other in the final.
The Whalers versus the Nordiques.
Do you think the NHL would let them wear those jerseys in the Cup final? I would. I get why, but I would love to see it.
No, I don't think they would. You probably saw the whole thing with the Penguins in round 1. I think you have to commit to your jersey for the final. And
really?
Yes, for a series, the Penguins wore the yellow home jerseys, and they weren't allowed to. Not that they wanted to change, but fans wanted them to change, and it turned out someone spoke to someone at the league. I think the Athletic had a story, and it's not even allowed. So you're not even allowed to wear multiple jerseys within a series. So I don't think it would happen. But it would be kind of cool. Imagine game one, it was Whalers versus Nordiques jerseys.
Yeah, feeling bad for Hartford and Quebec fans everywhere if that happens. But also,
I feel like enough time has passed. That's just my own view. Like those teams left 30 plus years ago.
Yeah.
If anything, it's sort of honoring your history and where you started. But anyway, we're not going to see it. I can tell you that I would be stunned if that happened. But we might see Carolina, Colorado in their current unis.
I'm telling you, that could be a really fun series. But we have to see how it goes, obviously, for Buffalo, Montreal, obviously, and Vegas and Anaheim. We'll see what happens with those teams that are still remaining. If they could completely usurp a dream cup final, at least for me, for Carolina and Colorado. That'd be fun. Anyway, do you have a stick tap? I know Matthew Schaefer is a pretty obvious candidate. Obviously, he wins the Calder Trophy. But anyone else top of mind for a stick tap?
Yeah, I think I'll go with Sidney Crosby. You know, it's pretty cool to me that he decided to join Team Canada at the World Championship and, you know, sets up as a third straight major tournament where he and Macklin Celebrini are tag teaming for Canada. And you know, just don't know how much runway is left on Sidney Crosby's career. We're not pushing him out of hockey, but, you know, his age is his age. And you know, I think it's cool that he's gone over to Switzerland to play for Canada. You know, kind of interesting that Team Canada had already named Macklin Celebrini the captain. You know, he was going to be the youngest ever captain Canada's had at such an event in men's play, and just 19 years old, youngest skater on the team. You know, as of this morning, it's still up in the air what they're doing with that captaincy. Oh boy. Yeah, I think there's an argument. You know, Sidney Crosby has been Canada's captain in every game he's played for the national team since he scored the golden goal in 2010 in Vancouver. He was an alternate captain for those Olympics with Scott Niedermayer as Canada's captain. He was 23. You know, since then he's worn the CA every time he's played for Canada, be it at the Worlds, the Four Nations, or the Olympics. So, you know, I think we all recognize if he had been named from day one of the roster, this wouldn't even be a debate or discussion. Crosby would have already been named the captain. So be curious to see, you know, they play their first game Friday against Sweden in preliminary round play, who actually comes out with the C, because as of Thursday that hadn't been formally finalized. But either way, letters are letters. We know that Crosby's a leader for Canada. Really has been the face of Canadian hockey for a long time, and he's playing alongside the next face of Canadian hockey, Macklin Celebrini. So I love the World Championship. Hockey on during the day is never a bad thing, and that tournament gets going this week. And it's cool that we get to see Crosby there at least one more time.
Awesome. I'll give two stick taps. So I'll give the first to Matthew Schaefer, wins the Calder Trophy. The first unanimous selection for the Calder Trophy since Timo Solani did it in 1993. Obviously a record-breaking season for the teenager. Really nice moment seeing him get the trophy on Good Morning America. He's with his family, obviously very emotional, thinking of his mom, who passed away a few years ago due to breast cancer. But just seems like a pretty cool kid and a really cool story to follow throughout this past season. So I think he's well-deserving of a Calder Trophy and deserving of a stick tap on our show. So he's the first one. And the second one, I'll give it to our colleague Renaud Lavoie from TVA Sport, who a couple days ago suffered strokes and it was not looking good for him. But he has since returned to his job during one of the games of the Montreal Buffalo series, was applauded in the media lounge by his colleagues. Always was a good colleague to deal with when I was in Montreal. And just happy to see him back on his feet. So two stick taps on my end, one for Matthew Schaefer and another one for our colleague Renaud Lavoie of TVA Sport.
Very fitting. Exchange some texts with Renaud. He seems like he's doing well, and I think he's overwhelmed by all the outpouring everyone's giving him. So good call, bud.
Yeah. And that's going to do it for today's edition of the CJ Show. Get your questions in now. A few of you have already done so, including one listener who sent a video that I don't know how we'll make that work for the next episode, but maybe you just have to watch it on your own end. But we have a couple people who've been sending in questions for Ask CJ. Get them in however you can, whether through Twitter, Instagram, whatever. We'll try to get to them as much as we can. Discord as well. And subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you all next week.
The Chris Johnston Show. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris and follow Julian @JKA McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.